Welcome to another lesson about strategy. I had some requests last week from a few viewers to do something about the Spanish or the Benoni or King's Indian or some other pawn structures that are very topical in the openings, and in particular to focus on the pawn breaks. So I'm actually not going to be doing exactly that, but this is something that I hope will lead up to a discussion of these more complicated pawn structures and their breaks. So I decided to start with the Stonewall, which is a pawn structure that is not really played that often as, I guess, a primary weapon, but it's something that arises frequently in a variety of openings. And there are two kinds of Stonewall. This one that we have here is the Kingside Stonewall. And this Kingside Stonewall, it's called Kingside Stonewall because it has this formation of blocked pawns, which is called a stonewall. Generally, these pawns don't do a lot of moving around for the rest of the game once they arrive at this position, hence the name Stonewall. And it's called a Kingside Stonewall because it's leaning mostly to the king side. You can see that here's the file where the kings stay on, and it's aligned perfectly with this king file. So this usually happens in openings like the Dutch defense or the Kali system. It just arises from those primarily, but it can sometimes appear in surprising ways. For example, pick any opening where you play the moves e3 and d4, such as the the London system. And in the London system, your pawn usually is on f2, and you have a bishop on f4. But if you play bishop c1 to f4 to g3 and then play f4, you already are on your way to having a stonewall, especially if black also plays f5. There's also the idea of a semi-stonewall, in which one of the pawns is out of place, but the rest of them are already there. So, for instance, if the black pawn was on f7, this would be a semi-stonewall. Or if this pawn was on f2, that would be a semi-stonewall as well. And the strategy is kind of different, but has a lot of similarities as well. There's also a queenside stonewall. This is the queenside stonewall. Hello, 66, welcome. This queenside stonewall, it's aligned with where the queens start the game, but it's the same. The pawns are all blocked in the center. And this queenside stonewall frequently happens in the English opening and the Sicilian defense. So talking about the Kingside Stonewall first. Actually, I guess what I'm going to say is true for all of the Stonewalls. In closed positions, that is, positions where the majority of the pawns are blocked, the play is going to be more slow. We usually see the more dynamic play where both sides are sacrificing pieces and blowing things up in the positions where the pawns are more flexible and fluid. So that's true equally in the kingside and the queenside Stonewall. And there are some strategic elements which are, I guess, somewhat obvious if you just think about it a little bit, but I'll outline them here. So imagine in this position, or any Stonewall position, that we have some bishops for both sides. Like, let's pretend that white has, maybe we'll pretend the bishops are on their starting squares for both sides. Maybe I'll just make these a different color to show that white doesn't have 4 bishops. That'll be a great luxury. Hello, Obama, you might change. We're talking about Stonewalls today. So let's pretend we have 4 bishops and the pawn structure stays the same. According to the traditional definition of a good bishop and a bad bishop, one of these bishops will be good and one of these bishops will be bad. For each side. So I guess I'll leave this to you guys. Which of the bishops will be bad for white and which of the bishops will be bad for black in this pawn structure if the bishops are where they are? What do you guys think? Motosems, welcome. Light square bishop is bad for white, that's correct, and it's good for black. And so if we're talking about the bad bishops will be opposite for each side, and the good bishops will be opposite for each side as well. And this tells us something very interesting strategically, that if we can trade our bad bishop for the opponent's bishop of the same color, it's going to be a major strategic asset because we will eliminate their most powerful bishop and we will eliminate our weakest bishop. So this is already obvious from the pawn structure. We don't have to see any model games or anything to understand this. Another thing that stands out about this structure is the presence of mutual central outpost squares. I was going to do a video just about outpost squares. I might still do it in the future because it's a very interesting topic. But we can just start here with this particular outpost square. So the reason it's an outpost square in the full Stonewall formation is that no pawns can chase away a piece that stands there. Other pieces can chase them away, but not pawns. So it's kind of going to be a long-term possible stronghold for basically any piece, although it's fairly unlikely that a rook will reach one of these squares without some exchange of pawns. But that also ends up being important, especially when you consider how there is such a thing as a semi-Stonewall, where one of the pawns is out of place. It could lead to some other interesting strategic aspects. So these are the two main strategic features. But let's talk about the pawn breaks for a second. I guess we could start with the Kingside Stonewall. So a pawn break is a way of activating your pieces using your pawns, and usually involves exchanging the pawns. So in a position like this, I think you might be able to guess why we want to exchange some pawns. If you imagine having rooks, like the same as what we did before, imagine the rooks are here and here. You would probably want to find some open files for them. You wouldn't want them to just like go like this and like this the whole game, right? So in order to open the files, we would have to advance some pawns. So which advances do you guys think would be the main breaks for white and black in this structure? Yeah, G4 and I think you mean G4 and C4. B4 is not really the main break, because if you play B4, it's not going to make contact with any pawns. So definitely we want to play this and this, and black would want to do the same because it's a symmetrical pawn structure. 66 says it depends where the kings are castled. I'm not saying which break do you want to do. I'm just saying what are the possible breaks. We won't even know. Even if we say the kings are castled kingside for sure, we don't know that we want to play like C4 or G4. It's not obvious just from where we castle, because attacking is not the only reason that we do a pawn break. It could just be to gain access to one extra square for the minor pieces or the rooks or whatever. So these are the breaks. And generally I would say that it's easier to accomplish the C4 break for like any random set of pieces on the board. And the reason for this is there's more room to maneuver on that side of the board, so we could find ways of getting more support onto that square. This is a little bit abstract, but we'll see some examples that are more concrete later on. Now let's talk about the queenside Stonewall. So what are the breaks in this structure for white or black, whatever you care for? Yeah, correct. It'll be F4, F5, B4, and B5. And the easier break to accomplish, which one do you guys think would generally be easier? Obviously, they're both important, but which one usually do you think would happen? F4 and F5, correct. There's more room to maneuver on this side. So you can think of the flanks as having different sizes depending on where the pawns are blocked. So this is a bigger flank for both sides in this queenside Stonewall. The Stonewall has a rather poor reputation as a pawn structure. I'm not completely sure why. I think it's because when you try to get a Stonewall from the first moves, usually it doesn't quite work. It's easy to either destroy the Stonewall immediately with a quick pawn break, or it's just kind of a very passive attempt. However, the Stonewall does happen often in practice from other move orders where it's more interesting. 66, you came a little bit late, but I did mention a couple openings. So this queenside Stonewall, you'll get it often in the English and the Sicilian. No surprise, because C5's played, C4's played. So you could easily imagine the follow-up. We play d6, d3, e4, e5, and suddenly we've got a Stonewall. It doesn't always happen like all at once. It can kind of creep in. Eventually you get a Stonewall in the middle game. And for the Kingside Stonewall, this usually happens in like Dutch defense and Kali system. Again, pretty obvious. Like if I get rid of all these arrows for a second, you can see that in the Dutch defense, which starts with 1 f5, we've already got one of the 3 moves that makes a full Stonewall. Dutch is suspicious, I agree. You might have seen my match with George. I put some clips of it on YouTube if you'd like to watch. I played a theme match in the Dutch and it went very well for me. So let's see some sample games for the strategy. We've already identified just 2 strategic factors. One is that we have a bad bishop and our opponent's bishop of the same color is good, and there's an outpost square. Let's see how the pawn play unfolds in these kinds of situations. The first game we are going to see, well, actually I should preface this by saying I got all of my model games for today from a book by Andy Soltis, which I highly recommend. Buy that book. It's called Pawn Structure Chess. I'm pretty sure that's true. One second. Yeah, it is called Pawn Structure Chess. I was just checking, and by the way, the author's name is Soltis, Andy Soltis. I was just checking because there's another guy who wrote a book, Flores, and his book is on pawn structures as well. It's kind of different. I think that book hypes it a little bit. It seems very authoritative, but I don't think it does as good of a job as covering the main pawn structures in exquisite detail the way that Soltis' book does. So I definitely recommend that. And we'll be looking at a few examples from his chapter on the Stonewall formation. I'm not going to be regurgitating what he has to say. I'm just going to be using the examples because I thought they were very good. Obama, you might change asks, do you think the woodpecker method is worth doing? Yeah, it's a puzzle book. I think all puzzle books are worth doing. I don't think you should follow their method, though. I think it's not very sensible. Anyway, so we're going to be seeing a game played by a guy named Mir Sultan Khan. Anybody know who this guy is? Have you heard of him? Alright, do you guys know any fun facts about Mir Sultan Khan? I think he's a very interesting character in chess history. So he is from the time period of Paul Morphy and Anderson and all these guys. Actually, no, not that time period. He's from the time of like Nimzovich and Capablanca. So the early 20th century. And he was not a major player. He only played chess for like 3 years, at least at the top level. And the reason that he only played chess for 3 years is because he was a slave for one of the top military people in British India at the time. And he just happened to be extremely naturally proficient in chess. And so his master identified this talent of his and permitted him to travel the world with him for just 3 years before returning to his position of servitude in India. And during these 3 years, he defeated almost all the top players at some point. Capablanca said something about him like he's the most talented person that he's ever met, like the most naturally gifted chess player ever. And this really does seem to be the case, because while he had no knowledge of theory, because he was like waiting on tables and stuff like that for his whole life and not reading, he was completely illiterate. I'll spell it for sure. He would just survive the opening and then play masterfully for the rest of the game with his natural ability. This is his name, Mir Sultan Khan. And so we're going to see one of his games, which was outstanding. This is also a very little known figure in chess history, which I find somewhat unusual, almost conspiratorial. I think it's kind of maybe ugly to acknowledge that someone in a very unfortunate position in life was one of the top players in the world at some point. I think people are just not generally comfortable acknowledging that. So Mir Sultan Khan's playing white. He's just developing his pieces. Don't mind me. that kind of thing. Then he occupies this potential outpost square e5. So nothing really unnatural at this point. Now we see a semi-Stonewall. Earlier I talked about the full Stonewall with a pawn on f5, and here we can see that the position is nearly that way. They just need to play f5, but there's a knight in the way, so it's not happening. So I guess I could break down the pros and cons of this semi-Stonewall like this. It has all the complexity of a Stonewall formation, because it could become one later on, so it's a more complex version. And there are some additional attacking and defending ideas for both sides. When you have the full Stonewall setup, you have more space, which means you are maybe a step closer to an attack on the side where you have more space. And the side that has not advanced all the way to f5, f4, or whatever, they have the option of controlling the outpost square by playing a move like f6. That's what it would be in this position. So it's a complex struggle, even though there are just like two really interesting features, which are the outpost square and the bad bishop. So let's see how it unfolds. Queen f3 is a very nice move. We'll see this again, I believe, in one of my later examples. Alright, so Obama My Change said that he thinks black has a static advantage here. That's an interesting assessment. So when I think of advantages as static, that means they're enduring advantages. So you're saying that the e4 square basically belongs to black, and it always will. Is that kind of what you're saying when you say that black has a static advantage? Okay, so I guess what you're saying has some merit, that the e5 square is contestable and the the e5 square is contestable and the e4 square is not. I kind of feel that way in some sense. If you can kind of trade all the pieces down so that there's no way to exploit the space advantage conferred by f4, then yeah, I think that occupying e4 will be way better. Yeah, f4 does have its advantages. For example, we can play queen f3 here without blocking, for example, a rook that comes on f1. We're going to have a lot of interesting options from the move f4. Also, it stabilizes the knight. You can't underestimate how important it is to stabilize this knight, because usually with an outpost square you don't want to occupy it immediately because it will get traded away. But in a position like this, if black just starts willy-nilly trading like this, they are going to forfeit their ability to use the e4 outpost. Right now, if they occupy it, we will win a pawn, and maybe more. It looks pretty bad like this. I think either c6 or bishop e4 is forced. It would be something like this. I think white has a major advantage here. And obviously that's for somewhat tactical reasons, because we made them try to go on the outpost square. But we can see that this tactic justifies white's strategy, because if they play a move like knight e8 in order to just avoid losing the knight, they're not able to ever really return. Or at least they're going to have to do a lot of work with a lot of cooperation from white if they want this. Yeah, and white can also break with e4, that's correct. So in the game they played knight fd7 straight away, trying to kick out the knight. Or maybe just trying to contest white's kingside space. So he played queen h3. And this idea is largely attributed to this guy Pillsbury. We'll see one of his games later on. The idea to play f4 and then queen d1 to f3 to h3 with pressure on h7. So in this position, black mitigated the pressure with f5. Yeah, it is a cool idea. I've used it a few times. I like it. If they play f6, they're going down, right? Checkmate. Boom. Got him. So f5. And maybe they're hoping to come back to e4 somehow, like this. But that's really slow, right? You play knight g8 to f6 to d7 to f6 to e4. This kind of justifies the attacking ideas that white has. So Sultan Khan just played knight f3, knight f6 again, bishop d2, just using all your pieces, normal natural chess. Now here comes bishop a6. Earlier we talked about how there's this interplay of good bishop and bad bishop. So you might think that Sultan Khan made a mistake here. He is allowing the exchange of his good bishop by force for the bishop that was bad for black. So he played rook g1 here. What do you guys think black should play? Why not c4 instead of rook g1? I guess you're trying to play c4, d takes c4, knight takes c4 in order to avoid exchanges, right? That gives up the d5 outpost, however. For example, after knight takes c4, knight d5, the knight on d5 is uncontestable because the c-pawn is gone. But that's a good point. The c4 break is available for white, but it's not transparently good at this point. That's part of what makes chess so complicated. Even though we have just a couple simple strategic features of the position, how we approach the pawn breaks is really, really difficult. And I picked the Stonewall first because I think it's the simplest pawn structure to play. I think everything is crystal clear because we know about the bad bishops and the outpost squares, these simple strategic concepts. And we know about how to make a pawn break. We throw that pawn out there and we make some trades. But it still remains complicated, which is why I have a ton of examples here. How much of a threat is g4? Good question. So I guess you're asking, like, if black plays a passing move, is g4 a major issue? I would postulate that after g4, the g file will come open no matter what, and that seems pretty major to me. Just give me 1 second, you guys. Well, what do you guys think about the most obvious approach? Trading the bad bishop for the good bishop. Because it is black's move here, right? So what are they going to do? If they don't like g4, I don't know if they can easily stop g4. Because it's been well prepared. There's a knight supporting, there's a queen supporting, there's a rook supporting. So you think it can't be bad for black. Okay, what do you guys think white would play after bishop d3? Bishop takes d3, g4. Yeah, amazing move. Alright, knight d3. Interesting. So in another one of my lectures, I showed an interesting example. A very common example. It's maybe so common that people didn't pay attention to it. Here, I'll show you that position one more time. I think I arrived at that position this way. Thanks for the following, Hack Comic. So this was a position I showed in another one of my lectures on Twitch and YouTube. Oh, 1 second. There we go. So in this position, I asked the question, should we exchange the bishop or no? If so, how? And in this position, we talked about one line where they take and the pawn takes back. In this position, I asserted that this is better for white because black is deprived of these important outpost squares, and they have this open file for the rook, right? So there's a marked similarity here, because after bishop takes d3, c takes d3. Yeah, we could play rook c1, but this is actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we are controlling the outpost square, and so black cannot do anything in the center. Additionally, it prepares the e4 break later on. So white has more breaks now. Actually, not more breaks, but it's kind of like they've already achieved the c4 break, because the reason you do that is to open the c file, and they still have the option to play g4, and now they have a new option, e4. So this wealth of options is just favorable for white. And meanwhile, black cannot play knight e4. Ever. Or knight c4. So the doubled pawn is actually really, really useful. Going into the endgame, it won't be so great, but we can liquidate it with e4 if we really have to worry about that kind of thing. But with a rook on g1, I don't think we have to worry about the endgame. So you guys will see. Bishop takes d3 was a blunder, even though it goes seemingly in line with the strategy of the Stonewall structure. So he went ahead with queen e8. He was playing a guy named Madison's. And then Sultan Khan played king e2, which is an outstanding move. This is another interesting thing about the closed positions. When the position is totally closed, your king is often very safe, like right where he started. And the only reason you would want to move the king is to connect the rooks. So out of habit, we might castle queenside, saying, I want to bring my queen rook to attack on the king side. But it's much more effective to just play king e2, because then you present 0 targets. So after king e2, they played knight d7, queen h4. How do I explain queen h4? I guess you'll just have to see what happens. c5, bishop c3. So now the e5 square is very well protected. It's protected 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So if you take there, it could end in disaster. Like if you take with the knight, probably I would take with the d pawn. That's a fork. That's a common strategic motif in this pawn structure. We want to prevent them tactically from taking. If they want to take, they would have to take with the bishop, and then probably this knight will get bullied to another place. In fact, this knight has nowhere to go, which is a funny irony. I guess it has to go here. But then after h3, g4 comes in. It's just awful. So they really can't take the piece, even though when you have an outpost square, you would like to take and make them take back with a pawn. The problem is that when white takes back with a pawn, they end up with much more space and some active possibilities. So what would you guys play here for black? Like, what's their best thing to try? It's not an easy position to play, of course. I guess it's just like nearly impossible. Knight g4, knight e5. Well, if you play knight g4, we will immediately win a pawn with knight takes g4. Queen h5 maybe makes some sense. Let me see. I think queen h5 might lead to a lost endgame, but that might be better than getting checkmated. So let's take a look at queen h5 very quickly. After queen h5, what would I play? I was looking at knight takes d7. The idea is that if they play knight takes d7, we will play queen takes h5. If they play queen takes h4, unfortunately we don't have this in-between move knight f6, so we have to take this way. But we still get to play g4 with very active play. I think that white is just better here. Maybe there's no good move for black, but I think queen h5 is much more reasonable than what they played. c4, b5. Okay, that's another interesting option. So let's take a look at that. This would at least give you control over e4 again, potentially. But it also sacrifices a pawn. But maybe sacrificing a pawn is exactly what needs to be done here. Like we take, and they could play something like bishop e7 and just hope to survive. This is probably better than going to the lost endgame, and also better than what black played in the game. I think this is just better, because you at least gain control of some key squares, like knight d5 is coming up. Unless there's some other tactic I'm not seeing here. Another interesting option for white is to ignore. Just play g4. It's not fun to play. You're right. But losing positions are never fun to play, but someone has to do it, right? They played c takes d4, but this is probably a decisive blunder. The reason is, now white not only has opened the c file, gotten control of e5, now they also have a great place for their other knight. They can play, well, not their other knight, bishop d4. I think the reason we should keep the knight here is to support the knight on e5, but I usually like to put a knight here in like a French defense type of position where we can also get this kind of stonewall. But usually when I do that, the knight is coming from f3, and so there's no knight on e5. Here, bishop d4 works just fine, and so the white pieces are super active. The game actually finished really in short order, so we'll see it. g4 came in, and even though this was not an easy break to prepare, black was very accommodating, so here it comes. One might think that all this trading is diminishing white's advantage, but it's actually just helping to activate the last piece that's not working, the rook on a1. So they played g6, and after rook ag1, they resigned. So just a pop quiz. Why do you guys think black resigned here? What's the matter with this position besides it being depressing? There's a decisive threat for white. What do you guys think it is? Okay, what's the mate? Alright, rook g6, queen g6. Yeah, can they defend? That's my question for you. Queen h8. King f7. I think that's a blunder. Maybe not a blunder, but at least you have to see more than that, I mean. It's not just a two-move mate. So we're looking at rook g6, queen g6. Maybe it's more resilient to play pawn g6. But I really don't think so. Well, it's up to you guys. Whatever you think is the critical line, just hit me with it. Yeah, why not queen h6? Good question. Maybe it doesn't matter so much, but I feel like it's like a pretty quick smash. Probably they're both winning. Let's actually just take a look and see. So the threat could be rook g6 or queen h6. It's actually black's move here, which is important, but you at least need to know the threat ahead of time. So let's pretend black plays some knucklehead move like this. This should probably win. Like, let's say we take with the pawn, the most obvious move. Queen h8. What's the best move here? I think it's pretty obvious, but then it should be easy to tell me. Yeah, queen f6. And then rook g6. So this is pretty precise. They sacrifice and then get mated on the move. So that already wins. Probably we don't have to see much more. If queen takes g6, it goes like this. Very similar. So that's why they resigned. At least I imagine so. I don't think they resigned just out of like awe. Well, it's also black to play, so we could see what happens if you defend the threat. Like, let's say you play like, alright, this position's probably too dumb to even make into an instructive moment. They don't have any moves. So we can move on from here. But this strategy of controlling the outpost square and also getting an open file is really important. That's why I picked this game to show first, out of the examples I saw in the book. So we're going to see another one now. This is between Albin, who's famous for a lame counter gambit, and Janowski, who I believe is most famous for being the immortal loser. He lost to Anderson in the immortal game. No, that was Kieseritzky. Janowski is a different guy, so my mistake. But Janowski's also from the same time period, pretty famous guy. So, as you can see, we're not in any kind of Stonewall opening. This is a Spanish. So you might be wondering, like, how are we going to get a Stonewall out of this? Well, it can happen. In fact, the Spanish opening has the potential to go into almost every pawn structure, which is why there's a saying in chess that when you learn the Najdorf, you learn the Najdorf, and when you learn Spanish, you learn chess. Okay, so there's already a similarity. There's already a similarity here between the last game and this game. But just to address the question about Berlin being bishop c4, this is the Berlin. I also made a video some time ago talking about endgames, and I used the Berlin endgame as one of my examples of how you can quickly liquidate to some simple position, and people call it an endgame. That was part of the intro of the video where I was discussing what it means to be an endgame. So you guys can check that out if you want to see more about the Berlin endgame that arises from this position. But here we're talking about one where there's an exchange on c6. In another one of my videos, I also talked about this trade, but we talked about it in the context of the Sicilian defense. So what do you guys think of this exchange, forcing b takes c6? Is this favorable for white, favorable for black, or something else? Obama Eat My Change says that white has a clear target. So what is white's clear target? c6? Okay. How can you exploit that weakness? Like, how are we going to attack c6? Alright, so queen a4 someday. But it'll take you like at least 2 moves to play queen a4, and in one move they can play like bishop d7 or something similar. I don't think they should really be under so much pressure. So it's debatable whether or not the pawn on c6 is weak. At the very least, debatable. If it turns out that it's weak, okay, it's weak, but we can argue about it. Something that's even more important though is the exchange that happened on c6. I did a video all about exchanges, so you can watch that if you're interested in how we should approach thinking about exchanges. And so here, white gave up their light square bishop for a knight. This means black has the bishop pair. Yeah, bishop pair is cool in an open position, but the position's looking like it could close up. Another interesting thing about this is the bishop that they traded is the one that would be bad in a Stonewall, right? For the Kingside Stonewall, it's a bad light square bishop. So that one's gone. So you would think it would be very favorable to go into a Stonewall formation from here. So let's see what happens. So this is preventing bishop g4 and knight g4, but not so important, it turns out. And now this is looking a lot like a Stonewall, right? Right now it's a semi-Stonewall. And in this position, Anderson had this idea with g4, and that's what was played here by Alben. So he's following the footsteps of a master. It's not his own idea. He did his homework. So black's just continuing to develop the pieces, it looks like. And then here comes his move, knight c5. I think knight c5 is a very good move. And this is a move which would be impossible in a full Stonewall. They can use the c5 square as long as the pawn is not there. So there's this interplay between the piece play and the pawn play. If you occupy the squares and make the Stonewall, those squares are no longer useful to the pieces. Yeah, exactly. He wants to play knight d7 to c5 to e6 to either d4 or f4. Which is a long maneuver, but it turns out it's black's destiny. So they played bishop e3, and knight e6 dodges the threat to capture and triple the pawns. And after queen d2, black to play. What do you guys think black should do in this position? The knight is in the best position. What's the next step for black's strategy in the Stonewall? Obama might change got it right first try, c5. And this is just like the last game actually. Now we have a full Stonewall, but with the caveat that there's now an extra c-pawn. So it's like a color flip version of the Mir Sultan Khan game that we saw. So they played knight e2, maneuvering to f5, I guess. Now after c6, it's not just that they can't put a piece on d5 anymore. They weren't even threatening to put a piece on d5. It's also the case that black has some additional breaks possible, namely the d5 break. So here comes the knight, and black is just activating the pieces. Good old Janowski. And after knight f5, he plays bishop f8, guarding all the weak spots that were attacked by the knight. Now he occupies the outpost square. And based on some of the strategies that we've seen, you would think it would be good to capture this knight, right? Well, it's not so good here, because black will just have this long-term space advantage, which is very annoying. So Obama Yuachini said bishop f8 is a move that he only sees from strong players. So maybe you should play bishop f8 in some of your games. I actually think that bishop f8 is a somewhat contentious move, but people mostly don't like to play bishop f8 because they think the bishop's not outdoing something. But since bishops are long-range pieces, it doesn't really matter that much. Also, sometimes to defend your weaknesses, it's good to just keep one minor piece defending them. You can attack with the rest of the pieces for some time. In the endgame, you really need to use every piece, though. So there it goes. And you would think he wouldn't want to save this bishop that's supposedly the bad bishop. But it's still a bishop. I think Kasparov or someone said that. No, I think Fischer said that even the worst bishop is still a bishop. It's better than a knight. So coming forward, they took, and after c takes d4, black still has doubled pawns, but now they have much more space than before. So here comes the attack. What should black play here? What do you guys think? So the kingside pawns are rolling in. They're trying to start some kind of initiative there. But black has this better pawn structure in the center. Probably black's worst placed piece is the bishop on c8. Yeah, d5 rar. I agree. This is what was played. d5 rar. And this also has a major tactical threat. If they play something pedestrian like g5 or h6, let's pretend h6, rar, then bishop b4, and you lose the queen. So that's pretty major, but not coincidental. When we play in the center, it frequently activates all of the pieces, especially the minor pieces. So here it comes. And this is breaking down white's Stonewall. Another way that you can rationalize this is there's a saying, which is fairly true, that an attack on the flank deserves a counterattack in the center. Usually in the Stonewall, the center is totally blocked, so playing on the flanks makes perfect sense. It's the right time, it's the right situation for playing on the flank. But in this pawn structure that we have in this particular game, the structure is fluid because black had two c-pawns and they were able to break the position. So the flank attack is kind of running low on steam when the center comes open because their king is still there. So they played king f1, trying not to ruin their attack by castling and trying not to run into any danger on the queen side with queenside castling. But after pawn takes f6, the attack is kind of stalling on the king side. It's not really coming together. Meanwhile, black has some very active prospects, namely the c pawn is now weak, the b pawn is weak, the dark squares are somewhat weak. They have some problems. Their king's in the center. So they went in for knight 3 to h4, going after some tactical cheap shots, I guess. And this is kind of forced to fix both weaknesses. Alright, now on the topic of pawn breaks, what do you guys think black should play here? Their pieces are all occupying maybe their ideal squares. How should we continue? Sometimes when you're deciding what move to play, it helps to kind of just take inventory of where you have your advantage. Probably, even though white's kingside attack is stalling, they still have the advantage there. White has more space, they have more active pieces there. Probably white still has the kingside advantage. So we probably should not play on the side where our opponent has the advantage. So the best move for black is a5, that's correct. With the idea of creating some more targets, this is another reason that we can do pawn breaks. We want to not just activate our forces, we want to create some targets, which also has the happy side effect of making our pieces more active. So a5, intending to bully these pawns on the queen side, is the idea. I guess you could think of this as a minority attack. I know it's just a one pawn minority, but it's strategically similar. So after a few moves, some mistakes were made in this game, ended in a draw. But after, I'll just show you maybe the fast forward. So Janowski activated all of his pieces to attack the queen side, which is textbook stuff. That's good. And then he finally broke with the pawn. He didn't do it right away. He only did it when he had something to gain. He really wants to take the c4 pawn. And now this b pawn is a backward pawn. It's a target. And he tries to infiltrate the open file. Again, bullying the b pawn. And the mistake that was made, it was really just a one move blunder. Because at this point he got a very favorable position. It's hard to imagine losing this position in the 21st century. Alright, let's actually see if you guys can play a better move than Janowski. So it's black to play. What should we do? I'll give you a hint. It's not queen d6. Or queen b7. No, he blundered into a draw. He didn't lose. He's like, well, I'll just put my queen on any light square. That'd be funny. Strategy. See, strategy is always coming a step after tactics. Tactics is much more basic. Obama ate my change. I feel your pain. In the last 24 hours, I flagged 2 positions with mate and 4 or something on the board. And it wasn't even bullet. Yeah, in one of the games that I lost, it would have been a draw if he didn't have a blockaded pawn on d5. Alright, so what's a good move for black? Seems like it's still tricky. I think he did something like just too desperate, but we'll see. Alright, bishop c5. That'd be nice. Alright, bishop b5. After bishop b5, you might still have an advantage. Hard to say. Like, let's say after bishop b5, they play a move like... Oh, I don't know. Rook h1. Let's play it on the board. Let's say they just play rook h1. The idea is to just double the rooks and start bullying the queen and the king. Straight up child abuse. If you play something like c5, first of all, that actually might make knight d6 strong at some point, although the queen's guarding right now. Double the rooks. I think these threats are nearly like winning for white. So probably you would have to come back to c6, something like this. And then after rook a7, I don't know if you can escape from this at all. It looks really, really dangerous. For example, king e6, rook e7 is mate. This is probably what Janowski was worried about in the position. Yeah, this is all real threats. So he played king g8, but this is such a hopelessly passive move. The best move to play here would be something that actively prevents rook a1. So I think the best move here would be d3. I think there's multiple good moves for black, but d3 is better. And the idea is that if they go for that same plan, they are restrained from playing rook a8 or rook a7 by the promotion threat. And so black retains their big advantage. King g8, king h7 is not good though, right? Let's take a look and see. So after king g8, so he played queen b2, which I guess the position's equal already, so what can you do? He played king h7, but this move rook a7 is very annoying because of rook takes g7. You're not going to really have any peace after you lose the g-pawn because all the light squares are well controlled by the pawns. The dark squares are controlled by the rook, by the knight, and the rook can attack from far away. So this game ended in the kind of draw that you would expect. Let's see it really fast. Yeah, you can really tell that was a draw, right? So, in this next game, let me see. What was I planning for this one? So this one, I'm talking about how the approach to a Stonewall position is a little bit tricky. So we're going to start with a weird French line that no one's played for like 50 years. At least that's the way I see it. If I'm wrong, feel free to point it out. Love it when I'm wrong and learn something. So queen h5, obviously we would love it if they castle, because we can take it with the bishop. Just kidding, checkmate. So knight d7 is a good move from black. And knight f8 is another good move from black. No, queen h5 is a very reasonable move. I don't think it's so icky. I just think that if you want to play like this, you should play it with e5, because then you can play queen g4 without e5 coming in. I think this would be much better. But anyway, here's our game. And you're probably wondering why this is in the Stonewall lesson. But it will become clear. I think knight f4 was a mistake, by the way. I don't think it's a very obvious mistake. I don't even know how to like completely explain why it's a mistake. I think one thing is that they could take on c3 and double the pawns in an opportune way when this knight leaves the guardianship of the knight. It also like makes this bishop very hard to coordinate. I'm not sure about it. I think rook fe1 was better. But in the game they played f6, which capitalizes on the bishop being forced. I mean, something is forced to leave the board at this point. The reason is that after bishop h4, I believe... Let's see, should we start with g6? Does it matter? I think g5 is good because they can play knight e6 to avert the disaster, but after knight e6, bishop g3, knight takes d4, they lose a pawn. So it's a tactic to win a pawn, basically. So you have to play knight e6 right now, followed by bishop e3 to avoid losing the d pawn. And losing the center pawns is a big deal, so you can't just sack it for nothing and say I have compensation. Now white played a3, which leads to the doubling of the pawns, which I mentioned earlier. It's kind of like it was fate. And this position is starting to look like a Stonewall in some way, right? It's another kind of semi-Stonewall if white plays f4. It would be, imagine the pawn on f4, it would be a Stonewall but with these pawns missing. Which is another interesting iteration of the Stonewall theme. What it means for those pawns to be missing is that, first off, there's one extra square for the bad bishop. It can go on that not so good square where the pawn used to be and pretend to be a pawn. The other thing is that the file is open, so the rooks can occupy or at least control the outpost squares. So the question is, should white play f4 and enter a Stonewall structure here? Or should they play for some other kind of pawn breaks or piece play? So bad bishops protect good pawns. Does that mean you would play f4? The good pawn? Probably not, right? It just doesn't feel right. And the reason, as you probably have already guessed, is that we have the bishop pair. We have two bishops. So why should we close the position? The Stonewall is as closed as it gets. An open file is going to do nothing for your bishops. f4 is what was played in the game. This game was Soloviev versus Novotelnov, and this was in 1961. So in this game, he played f4, and now he's not like losing on the spot. It's not like he made a tactical blunder, but this is a really hideous mistake, and he paid for it, so we'll see how. First, black immediately took over the outpost square. And then he immediately took over another outpost square, c4. Alright, and now he's playing knight d8. What do you guys think is the purpose of this knight d8 move? Like, why would we ever do that? Moving the knights backwards should be illegal, right? Probably black should be summarily executed for such a move, unless there's a good reason related to the Stonewall. Yeah, the idea is knight f7. And what's his ultimate destination? Sounds like the title of a bad movie series. Ultimate Destination 16. Ultimately, they want to go on e4, but yeah, through knight d6. Correct. So this is exactly what happened in the game. So some top-notch, top-shelf maneuvering. And check out these maneuvers from the bishops. It's just pathetically attacking nothing all over the place. He even went for this desperate move g4. I believe this was uncommented in Soltis's book. But it's just like really bad because now he also has a king safety problem. One thing just led to another. And believe it or not, the knight from a5 is the one that ended up on e4. But it doesn't really matter. Either way, a knight was going to end up there. This one just had a tactical opportunity and made it. Alright, so now here comes the opening of the position. Or at least here there was a threat to open the position, which forced the bishop on h4 to be even worse. And they just got squeezed to death. This style wasn't invented by Carlsen. It's been around for a long time. He's just doing it very well. So the knight on e4 was super good. And they actually resigned here, I believe. The f4 pawn is very difficult to defend, right? You might say impossible. They could play queen f3. But I think after a move like knight d2, it's going to all come crashing down. So that was that game. And this one, let's see, how am I going to preface this? Well, let's just dive into the game, actually, for this one. So, again, we're coming from some weird move order. You would never say Stonewall's happening. Alright, trick question. Usually you don't start a trick question by saying it's a trick question, but here we are. What opening is this? Hey Jakester, welcome to the party. I'm glad you finally made it. Stay a while and listen. We have a trick question here if you'd like to try it, Jake. Hack Comic, welcome. Well, you were here earlier. I just mean welcome to the chat. I didn't see you quite before. Queen's Indian Attack. That'd be nice. This opening, it's actually easier to decide what it is if you color flip it in your mind. So try that and then let me know if you realize what opening it really is. Pretend the white pieces are black and the black pieces are white. What opening would it be? Let's see. D5 would be D4. C5 would be C4. The knight on C6 would be a knight on C3. That's looking like some kind of Queen's Gambit. And it's a Nimzo. Yes, Chestoofus. And welcome to the chat. It's a Nimzo with colors reversed. And you can tell because in a normal Nimzo... Now, I'm not a Nimzo player, so if I make any gaffes, please don't come for me. The position usually starts out looking like this. And if I rapidly switch back to the other position... you can see that it's just the same, but it's flipped around and with a couple extra piece moves. So if you play the Nimzo with with black, then you would know that we should probably not play a move like D4. Usually in the Nimzo, we're going to play something like Bishop C6 and Knight E5. And the idea here is to play one of these two pawn breaks, C4 or F4. Jakester is asking, did I get a blue snowball? I can kind of hear it. Is that a microphone? I don't think I did. I got a throwaway microphone from a dedicated lifelong fan. And when you say you can kind of hear it, do you mean my audio is low? Okay. So this pawn structure actually has a different name. Hack Comic, thank you very much for the subscription. By the way, anyone who subscribes, I'm completely ready to analyze 2 of your games. So feel free to just shoot me a message on Discord, preferably. And I'll analyze 2 games of your choice and let you know what I think you need to do to improve. Well, yes, I did actually get a new microphone. That's true. Taking it mildly seriously. So, this is basically a Carlsbad structure. Carlsbad is also called orthodox exchange pawn structure. And the idea is that when we have this kingside majority, we want to go attack their king at all costs, which really probably informed this bishop d6 move. Although I think other moves don't make a lot of sense otherwise. It's not really like stylistic. It's just a good spot for the bishop. But they want to attack. This pawn structure usually appears with colors reversed. In the Queen's Gambit type stuff. So anyway, white continued to misplay chess. What do you guys think black should do? So think Stonewall, right? We should ask ourselves, is it a good idea to make a Stonewall formation here? And if so, how do we do it? And it's black's turn. By the way, guys, I sometimes do extra content on YouTube, things that are not Twitchy. So there's a link to my YouTube. All right, so Jakester suggesting h6. So I guess your idea with h6 is just to kind of bolster h7 long term. Maybe you're worried about a Greek gift. Sacrifice. I don't think you have to worry about that so much, though. Like, they have this attacking prospect, but for it to work, h7 needs to actually be weak. And with this knight on f6, and with this bishop not even able to attack it, I think that it's kind of a pipe dream for white. So a Stonewall formation, it usually looks like this. We're going to have these pawns blocked in the middle. Actually, I'll make blacks a different color. This is what the Stonewall formation generally will look like. So if black wants to get their side of a Stonewall, how are they going to accomplish it? What do you guys think? And this is completely in the theme of pawn breaks, which was the viewer requested topic today. We're trying to figure out how we can successfully employ our pawns. All right, so Jake suggested knight g4. Knight g4 is frequently repelled by h3. So if you're going to play knight g4, you have to be happy to put your knight on h6. How do you feel about that? Is that good? Another interesting point, if I can find the colors, is that these squares would be outpost squares in this structure. So usually we want to put a piece on the outpost square. So if you play knight g4, you're actually going away from that. Okay, rook e is another interesting move. I guess you're trying to prepare a break with e5 or something. Alright, so Jake just got it. It's knight e4. If they take it, they lose their most valuable bishop, the one that had any chance of attacking black's king. And here they tried to undermine the center. And the way that we complete the Stonewall is with f5. Notice how this actually activates the rook from f8 without moving it. Sometimes you don't need to move the pieces to get them improved. You just have to move things out of their way. So f5 expands the scope of this rook considerably, and it bolsters the control of e4. And this greater space allows black to attack the king very effectively. In fact, Polagaevsky, who was playing as black here, defeated Feuerstein from this position, so we will see. Feuerstein continued with b4. I guess he's trying to gain some space of his own. But I think when we're looking at positions with mutual attacks, there's always some edge for the side that's attacking on the side where the king lives. At some point, you could always say, I don't care what you do on the queen side if the king doesn't live there, because mate wins the game. So Polagaevsky threw an a5 just to kind of stall any further play on that side of the board, because now black has some space there too. And it was kind of his destiny to play knight e7 as it is. Like, if he played a6, this would just be too weak. He'd anyway have to do it. So he went for it under more favorable circumstances. After c5, he moved his bishop because he's a good boy, and when your bishop's under attack, you don't lose it. Feuerstein finally developed his knight, the last piece. Alright, so now we're playing black, and we want to go and attack their king somehow. We want to use all of our pieces to accomplish this. So what move would you guys play here? How do we continue? And keep in mind some of the strategic themes. Here we've already sunk a piece on the outpost square. That's good. We've already established the structure, so we have more space. And in this pawn structure, we have one bad bishop, the light square bishop, and one good bishop, the dark square bishop. So just keep these things in mind when you're deciding what should be done. Yeah, it's black to play. Definitely white has the advantage on the queen side, so we don't really want to play on that side of the board. Something else we need to do here. By the way, guys, I've started simuling on an almost daily basis. Usually it's around 6 p.m. because that's when I can play my students. So if you guys are following me on Lichess, you can join in on the action anytime. So Hack Comics says knight g6. So knight g6 would be activating the knight, and I'm guessing that you want to play maybe knight h4 and exchange it for the knight on f3. That's a reasonable idea. But I wouldn't say that the knight on e7 is our worst placed piece. In fact, I think the knight on e7 has a good future on f5. At some point, we might be able to get it there. So probably I would do something different. So Obama might change, found bishop e8. Makes not just some sense, it makes total sense. Bishop e8 looks strange. Again, we're putting our bishop on the back rank. But this is just a maneuver to get it outside the pawn chain. This is super common in the Stonewall structure. We'll go here, or sometimes g6. So this happens in the French, this happens in the Dutch. This is a very, very common maneuver when you have pawns on e6 and d5. Because you have no other way of activating the bishop in the middle game. But it's a long maneuver, so it's risky. Usually you only do it at a critical juncture like this one, where we don't have other clearly better moves to play. A maneuver is any sequence of moves where you go from a bad square to a bad square and eventually to a good square. So you're not really that happy in between. That's why it's important to do it when other important things have already been done. So they played rook c1. I guess they're just bullheadedly going ahead with their queenside play. Maybe they're also trying to prevent knight to c3 at some point, but I doubt it. And here comes that bishop. So at this point, even if it trades itself for a knight, this is a big success. Because we couldn't get them to play like knight e5 and knight takes d7 before. Just giving the bad bishop for a knight is an accomplishment. But you also don't have to, because a bishop is still a bishop, right? Bishops are often better than knights. So they went ahead with knight g6, which was Hack Comics' move. But they only did it after they improved the bishop. Because if you play knight g6 first, you can't play knight e8 to h5. Order matters. And so here comes g3. And the idea with g3 is to prevent knight h4 and knight f4. But it's also very weakening. It weakens the light squares completely. So for that reason, Polygaevsky jumped in on g4, aiming for h3. And since bishop h3 wins an exchange, Feuerstein played king g2. And in this position, it's lights out. Let's see if you guys can find the winning move. It's very subtle. And I like it. I hope you'll like it too. h5. So why are you playing h5, Obama? 8 might change. That doesn't seem very subtle. Obama, you might change, professes to be a caveman. Okay. I guess this is how cavemen play. f4. F4 would be great if they were forced to play G takes F4. But unfortunately, I think they'll hunker down and not do that. Alright, so Jake says knight h4 is not subtle. Let's see. Is it subtle? I guess they would play knight takes h4. Yeah, I don't see anything with knight h4, but something like that. Keep thinking in that way. We want to do something to open up their king, but it needs to be more forcing. If you cross Jake's idea with Hack Comics' idea, you'll get the right idea. Yeah, knight f4, absolutely. So knight f4 is a crazy good move. So if they don't take it, they lose a bishop and then some. So here comes pawn takes f4. And the follow-up is just bishop takes f4. And white is dead lost, even though they're up a piece, because they have no way of protecting their king and no way of activating their pieces. They're in a complete bind. Let's maybe think about for a second about why they're in such a bind. So their good bishop, the bishop on d3, it can't do anything because of the pawn on f5. The e5 outpost, they can't use it, I guess, because exchanging that knight would be bad for them. For example, knight e5, bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5, queen h4. The knight on f3 is doing some important work because of the attack that black had, so it can't occupy the outpost square directly. Additionally, the knight on d2 is hanging, so if they play knight e5, we would start out with probably bishop takes d2 even. So there's two problems with that. One strategic and one is tactical. And they're both relevant because if you play this right now, this is winning. And if you really want to play knight e5, you could start like this. I think I would take with the f-pawn. But then for just pure strategic reasons, it's failing. I wonder if we can play queen h4 here as well. I think the answer is no. I think that queen h4 is much stronger in this scenario. But we'll see more about this in the actual game. They played bishop c3. And here comes the queen. He played this move, I guess, to try to play h4 in order to make some space for the king. And also to play king f1 in the short term. If black played a passing move here, like a4. Alright, a4 is just too bad. Let's make a better waiting move. Alright, let's pretend it's a4 because I can't bring myself to make other moves. I think after h4, there might be a glimmer of hope for survival. Because queen g6, king f1, they don't have room to play bishop h3. The rook is guarding it. So I think h4 is actually a valid defensive idea. But here they have only king f1, because in this position, there should be a forced win. If you guys see it, just put it in the chat. I'm not completely certain. I didn't analyze this ahead of time. I think we just win an exchange or something similar. I was looking at bishop f3, king f3. And then like knight c3, rook c3. Actually, this is very tricky. So if they play h4 here, what do we do? Bishop f3, king f3, queen g4 is mate. It's the kind of stuff that you don't see when you teach all day. Alright, so king f1, queen h6. The reason it's not just bishop h3 is because after king e2, probably you're still winning, but it doesn't look that clear. So it's better to play a move like queen h6. And this has a major threat. If they play something like king e2, I think knight c3 should win something. Let's just check it out. Rook c3, bishop d2, bishop f3. This should win at least 2 pieces. Because if king f3, then queen d2. So that's why they play bishop takes e4. And the rest is just, as they say, a matter of technique. Okay, so here's the next real test. All right, let me just check to see if it's like not trivial. 1 second, you guys. All right, I think it's actually trivial. I'm not gonna quiz you on this one. They played bishop takes d2. I think rook f6 might also be winning, but this is just good because after like bishop takes d2, they'll play, I guess, rook f6. With the idea that if you play bishop f4, we can just take it, and if bishop to g5, we can play this, and there's going to be a checkmate no matter what. Like, that's already mate. So that's the idea. They resigned right here after bishop d2. And in the end, black Stonewall is almost still intact. It's only that their f pawn has advanced further. So, very interesting. And I guess the problem is just that like white basically lost a race. They were trying to improve their queenside, but black was able to establish a bind and attack very effectively. They just got the Stonewall under very favorable circumstances. So even though black wasn't aiming for the Stonewall from the beginning, like this is the opening position. They weren't aiming for a Stonewall from the beginning, but it became favorable at some point because of decisions that white made, namely this move d4. All right, let's see. I've got a couple more examples. So we're going to talk about a Kingside Stonewall here. And this is basically a Dutch Stonewall. And it's a partial Stonewall because they didn't play f4. And this is probably the first true Stonewall game that we're going to see. Usually, the Stonewall pawn structure occurs in many move orders, but there's a Stonewall opening, which is what we're seeing here with black immediately putting all the pawns on a single color. So I'm just playing through the opening for you guys. Okay, so here's an interesting position. It's a semi-Stonewall on the king side. What should white play? Any ideas? All right, f3. So f3 is like saying, I don't want the knight to come back on e4. Maybe you're preparing e4 yourself. So that's interesting. So Obama Ate My Change says c takes d5. What's your reasoning for c takes d5? Like Hack Comic's reasoning for f3 is probably to keep a piece out of e4. So why are you taking on d5? Open the file for the rook. Okay, but it opens the file for black's rook as well, right? So how do you know it's favoring you? The knight and bishop are on good scores too. Yeah, so Jake hit the nail on the head. That black's rook isn't there yet, so it's probably better to open the file in that sense. So in the position, c takes d5 is great. If you want to get really concrete, well, not really concrete, but more specific, I should say. So if they play c takes, which is not what happened in the game, we get control of the c file first. How should we proceed from here? Maybe we should play knight b5, something like this. But we could also just immediately go after it with... Actually, I think knight b5 is just good. Because if they play a6 to kick you out, you play knight c7. And they won't be able to get you to leave at some point. At least I think that's true. Actually, are you getting trapped here after rook f7? Nope. Knight takes d5 with the discover attack on the bishop. So they don't have time, it looks like. That wasn't a thorough analysis, but that's the idea. So we're going to have the c file first. And if e takes d5, we get what happened in the game. So this pawn structure, not quite Stonewall-y, right? This looks a lot more like a Carlsbad pawn structure at this point. So what do you guys think is the strategic idea for white in a position like this? The Stonewall is looking a little bit shaky in the center, but objectively black has more space. Hippo defense, welcome, and correct, minority attack. So in a position like this, when you have a smaller number of pawns on the flank, it can be profitable to advance those pawns and attack the enemy pawns. This was considered completely false and ridiculous chess in the start of the 20th century. And there was even one commented game by Steinitz where in the tournament book they said, I don't know why Steinitz played like this. All he's doing is giving a passed pawn to the opponent. But he was just way ahead of his time. Like, people didn't really understand. So the way we start the minority attack is with b4. This is basically a Carlsbad structure, but where black is a pawn on f5. I guess you could debate whether this is good or not, but one of the obvious side effects is that until they play f4, that bishop on c8 is not going to be so awesome. And our idea with advancing these pawns is to create some targets. It's the dynamic idea. So after b5, they should not have taken on b5, but they did. This game happened in... What year did this game happen? Let me check. This game was in 1955, so maybe it hadn't quite caught on that the minority attack was a big thing, but probably they should have figured it out. So they played queen d8. Queen c2, taking full control of the file. Knight c7, occupying the 7th rank with a knight. Usually you want a rook there, but the knight's doing a good job too. It's an octopus. Okay, and queen c6, creating some threats. So rook f7 is preventing queen takes b6, I guess. So here comes knight e6. And you would think that we don't want to trade the bishop who did nothing for the knight, but in the end, a bishop is still a bishop. It's slightly better than a knight usually. And here it comes with a threat. Rook c8 is on the menu. So they played rook e7, lost a pawn, traded pieces in a fancy way, and reached a dead lost endgame. So it's almost like magic, right? Suddenly all black's pawns just disappeared. And the way this happened was white successfully carried out this minority attack. So this is another idea in the Stonewall structure. So here we have a Stonewall where they played b6, which is highly suspect, in my opinion. And after c takes d5, a pawn break, whichever way black took, white would get possession of some important squares. And in this case, the minority attack gave full access to the c file, which gave full access to the 7th rank. So this is just the instant replay. And that d pawn ended up falling in the end. So it got kind of weak. So even in the end, black has 2 versus 1 on the queen side, but it doesn't do them any good. The rest of the game was like this. Goodbye, pawn. If they played a5, there was just no hope that they would ever advance them. Like, let's say a5. There might be something even better than this, but I was thinking bishop b5. Bishop c4 also looks interesting. For example, here's a funny line. Rook c8 attacking the bishop, rook d8, mate. Good night, Jake. Good night, Obama. You might change. So after rook c8, bishop a6. It was just a lost rook endgame. They resigned here. Okay, probably I'm going to turn in here as well. There are lots more games to see in the Stonewall structure, but this is a pretty decent overview of all the main ideas, you know, with the outpost square, with the bad bishops, and the pawn breaks are pretty limited, but obviously just because there are a few breaks doesn't mean that they're not nuanced and undeserving of further study. So if you want to learn more about these kinds of things, I definitely recommend this book that I got these examples from. The analysis is partly mine, but it's not just like a copy pasta. But I do recommend this book. It's Pawn Structure Chess by Soltis. Okay, let's see. I think probably now is a good time to raid someone. And if you like this, you can join the Discord.